All right, so this is going to cover our first little topic in Unit 6, which is about interpreting formulas. So figuring out how many atoms we have of certain elements in a formula and how we get the total number of atoms. So we can use chemical formulas to tell us two things: which elements are present, and then to indicate the amounts of elements present. So it's telling us what's there and in what amounts. So we're going to first start by talking about subscripts and how they affect a formula. So this tells us in a formula how many of each ion or atom are in a compound. It allows us to see the ratio between ions or atoms in a compound. So if I am looking for the ratio between calcium and phosphate ions, calcium ions are going to be our Ca ions, and phosphate is this PO4 group. Okay. If I look at their subscripts, the 3 here is saying that we have 3 Ca2 plus ions. Okay. And then this 2 is really telling us that we have 2 of our PO4 3 minus ions. So it's giving us the ratio between these two parts, our positive ion and our positive ion, and yes, our negative ion there. So the ratio between those two would just be 3 to 2. Okay, so one little thing, when this 3 is directly next to an element, that's telling us how many of that specific element there are. When the 2's on the outside of the parentheses, it's saying we have 2 groups of these, which we're then going to apply to each atom within the parentheses. So from here, if I have the number of calcium ions, okay, I'm going to use its coefficient of 3, subscript. And then if I look at my PO4 ions, my phosphate ions, I have that 2 right next to the group. So that means I have 2 of them. But how do we determine the phosphorus atoms and the oxygen atoms? So this is where we're going to have to look at what's inside the parentheses and then outside the parentheses. So this, when we look at phosphorus, technically this has a 1 next to it that we're not showing. So with phosphorus, we have 1 inside the parentheses, but we have 2 of those groups. So with this, if you think about 2 PO4s, okay, I have 2 phosphorus atoms present. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your 1 times the 2 on the outside to get 2. So this would be 1 times the 2, which would give me 2 atoms of phosphorus. Okay, this 4 is directly next to O, so it only applies to O, or oxygen. So I have 4 inside the parentheses, but I have 2 of those groups. So if you think about me writing PO4 twice, I would have 4 plus 4, or 8. So whenever you have, again, in this case, 4 inside the parentheses, I'm going to multiply it by that number outside the parentheses. So for oxygen, I'm going to have 4 times 2, which will be equal to my 8 atoms. If I wanted to know what's the total number of atoms or ions for some of these in the Ca3PO42, I would want to be adding up my calcium plus my phosphorus plus my oxygen. So I'm splitting them up into their 3 individual elements. So this would be 3 plus 2 plus 8, which would be 13. Okay. All right, so we're just going to do a bunch of practice with these, and then you're going to be doing some practice on some slides. So let's just go through the first 2, and then I'm going to pause it and have you do the next 2. So for this one, I'm just looking at how many potassium, carbon, and oxygen atoms or ions there are. So with this one, this 2 just applies to the potassium. So I have 2 potassium. Okay, I don't have any number directly next to carbon, so I can assume that that's a 1. I have no parentheses involved, so I just have 1 carbon. And then this 3 is directly next to oxygen, so it only applies to oxygen. So that means then I have 3 oxygen. Okay, if I wanted to know my total, I would just add those together. So 2 plus 1 plus 3 would give me 6. All right, so let's look at one that's a little bit tougher only because we have parentheses there. So I'm going to split this up into elements. I have nitrogen, hydrogen, sulfur, and oxygen. So let's do the 2 that don't involve any parentheses. So if I look at S and O, this 4 only applies to oxygen, and then I'm not showing it, but there's a 1 there next to sulfur. And this 1 only applies to sulfur. So I have 1 sulfur, and then I have 4 oxygen. So let's look at what happens again when we have these parentheses or brackets around there. So within the parentheses, I have 1 nitrogen and 4 hydrogen, but I have 2 of those groups. So remember, I'm going to multiply everything inside of that. So this 2 is going to multiply the nitrogen, and the 2 is going to multiply the hydrogen. So for nitrogen, it's 1 times 2, which would give me 2 atoms of nitrogen. And then for hydrogen, it would be 4 times the 2 on the outside, okay, which would give me 8. Okay, and again, you can think of that 2 there as if I were to write out 2 NH4s, I have 2 nitrogen, okay, and I have 4 plus 4, or 8 hydrogen, so that matches the numbers that I got. Okay, if I was looking for a total here, I would have 10 plus 1 and 4, which would give me 15. All right, so in this next one, I'm going to want you to pause the video and see if you can come up with aluminum atoms, silicon atoms, and oxygen atoms. All right, so let's see how you did. This 2 only applies to aluminum. Okay, so I have 2 aluminum ions or atoms. Okay, when I look at silicon, I'm going to have the 2 applying to the silicon and the oxygen. So for silicon, I have 1 inside the parentheses times the 2 on the outside. So I have 2 silicon atoms. And then for oxygen, I have 3 on the inside times the 2 on the outside, which would give me 6. And if you did go ahead and find the total, you should have 10 there. Okay. All right, I also want to, and maybe after this one, you'll feel a little bit more comfortable doing D. So I want you to find how many gallium ions there are, how many chromium atoms there are, and how many oxygen atoms there are. So just pause the video for a second and answer the question, and let's check your work. All right, so with gallium, I have a 2 directly next to it. So I have 2 gallium ions. All right, with chromium and oxygen, they're inside a set of parentheses with a 3 on the outside. Remember that 3 is going to apply to the chromium and to the oxygen. So with chromium, okay, I'm going to have 2 times 3, which is going to show me 6 atoms. With oxygen, I have 7 on the inside times the 3 on the outside, which would give me 21. Okay, if I wrote this out in pieces, and not that this is actually how it's written, I have 2 galliums, and I have 3 of these Cr2O7s. Okay, if we think about adding them up, here's my 2 galliums. If I have 2 plus 2 plus 2, I have 6 chromiums. And if I add these guys together, I would have 7 plus 7 plus 7, which would give me the 21, which I'll check out. Okay, obviously multiplying them across is a little bit faster, but you can kind of think of it of like where are these numbers actually coming from is because we're actually counting how many that we have. And then if you did find the total here, it would just be 8 plus the 21, which would equal 29. Okay, so now you're gonna do some practice on your own and make sure that you are okay with figuring out how we get the number of atoms.